Hello everyone! In this week's video, I'm going to redraw an old piece of art into what I wanted it to be. You know how sometimes you get an idea for a piece of art, but you are unable to execute the idea? Well, that happened to me a lot when I was young, and I thought that maybe it'd be fun to revisit an old piece that didn't turn out how I wanted it to, and try to draw it closer to how I wanted it. The drawing I chose is this one. It was made on May 2nd, 2011, so I would have been 15. My idea for this picture was that I wanted to draw a lonely looking girl sitting in a window. I wanted it to look like she was yearning to be outside, and I also wanted to have there be a town or village in the background. However, that was too complicated for younger me, so I didn't include the town. I remember working pretty hard on this picture, but when I finished the picture, I wasn't all that happy with it. It wasn't what I had imagined in my head. Plus, I wasn't happy with the pose since it looks like the girl is going to fall out the window. I had a hard time drawing sitting poses, so let's revisit this idea and see if I can make it closer to what younger me imagined. As usual, I'm starting out by sketching the composition. Of course, we're going to keep the details of the girl and her sitting in the window. However, the view is going to be more turned so that we can see more of the background. I'm also changing up the pose so that it looks like the girl is actually sitting and not slipping out the window. I did change up the design of the window. The original one was kind of just a square hole in the wall. This time I drew a frame with a rounded top and also included the doors that are open on each side. Like I said, I wanted the girl to seem lonely and like she's yearning for the outside world. My original idea for the girl is that she is secluded and by herself, or maybe not allowed to go outside for some reason. To help further convey this feeling of isolation, I'm adding a wall to the background. And of course we are going to have the village that I wanted in the first picture. This suggests that there's life around the girl, but she's not a part of it. Now that I have my thumbnail, I will enlarge the picture to the full size of my canvas and start sketching out things in more detail. So even though I have improved a lot since I was 15, I was nervous to work on this picture. There's a lot of different details and things going on in this picture, and I don't draw architecture super often, so I was nervous to draw the buildings as well as working with perspective. And to be honest, for a lot of this picture, I was purely vibing the perspective, so hopefully everything looks okay or not super wonky. A lot of times for pictures like this with a more perspective-heavy background, I like to get things very in place and calculate all the lines. However, for this picture, I felt like if I had tried to do this, I would have lost motivation. I would have gotten too caught up in trying to get everything just right. So I did something I don't often do. I vibed it. And I kind of just tried to do what I felt like seemed good. Thankfully, drawing the character wasn't too daunting of a task. For her pose, I did make it much more slouchy, and I have her sitting further back in the window frame. For her outfit, I am keeping it very similar, but I did change up some details. Like instead of her dress being off the shoulder, it has full sleeves. And I did also change up the design of the sleeves a bit to have a more drapey part at the ends of them. I was slightly dreading drawing the skirt. I never like drawing longer skirts in sitting positions, but thankfully because of that, whenever I do see longer skirts in sitting positions, I try to study them. I drew the skirt with a bit of movement since I do plan to draw many of the elements blowing in the wind. In the original drawing, the expression of the girl looked fairly blank. This time I'm drawing the girl with a bit more of a sad expression. I had a lot of fun sketching her long hair. I feel like I don't draw characters with really long hair super often, so I enjoyed getting to play with it and its movement in the breeze. I wanted it to feel very loose and drapey. I did make the hair a bit shorter than it is in the original. The length in the original just felt like it would be a bit too hard to work with and also seems a bit impractical. Also, I did decide to give her shoes this time, mostly because I didn't feel like dealing with drawing tights on feet. But I did add the detail of one of her shoes kind of slipping off her foot. I felt like this added a bit of character and kind of helps convey that maybe she's lost in thought and she isn't noticing she is going to potentially lose her shoe. Next was drawing the window. I made some copies of the lines I made for the edges of the building and placed them where I wanted the window to roughly be. I am using these as guides to keep everything going in the same direction and angle. Next, I create the shape of the window and transform it until it feels right. Like I said, I'm trying to rely on my instincts more. So as I'm explaining the process, it may sound kind of vague. I made a copy of this shape to figure out the inside portion of the window. I wanted to make sure the inner curve matched the outer curve. To make the frame look more 3D, I drew in the side of the frame and it follows the main shape I made earlier. Next, I did a similar process for the doors. I made their main shape and transformed them to fit the perspective. And I mostly blocked in the different edges with shades of gray. I find this faster and easier to do when I'm just figuring out the shapes. and I'll worry about the line work later on. I do apologize if the architecture isn't super accurate. I am an artist and not an architect. I did find some different references for the window itself, so hopefully it looks okay. And I am going to keep the detail of the curtains blowing out of the window, since I do like the movement that they add. For the town in the background, I made a sort of grid for myself using a bunch of lines. Once again, these will help me keep all of my lines going the same way. I then just draw in some simple shapes to create the different buildings. I do plan to blur the buildings, so I'm not too worried about making them super detailed. I didn't mind this more zoomed out viewpoint, but a lot of the lower area of the picture felt unneeded, so I decided to transform the sketch to focus a bit more on the character and create less empty space below her. Next, I'm doing the cleanup sketch for the character, and I will be using this for the final art. My plan for this picture was to mostly go about working on it in my usual way, but to also mix in a bit of digital painting for some elements. Like, I plan to paint over the character later to clean up the sketch a bit, and we'll also paint in more details like smaller hair strands. Also, I guess I haven't mentioned that this is my personal piece for January. So yeah, I drew this picture all the way back in January, but I actually didn't complete it until mid-February. Just like my past few videos, this video is pre-made so that future me can rest after having our baby. Hopefully future me still likes how this picture turned out. This picture was a big undertaking, and I spent probably close to 9 hours on it, so that's why it took me a few weeks to finish. I definitely wouldn't have been able to finish this art in time for one of my usual weekly videos. For this picture, I was trying my best to not use 3D models because I wanted to try to draw things myself. However, I really didn't feel like drawing the stone on the building, so I found a 3D stone pattern on the Clip Studio Paint asset library and placed it into the picture. This was definitely a lot faster and way more convenient. I also used the 3D prisms to block in some details along the edges of the tower. Next, I outlined the window frame and doors and also filled in all the base colors. This was a long and tedious and boring part of the process, so we are going to speed through it because I don't have much to say about it. Now we can move on to rendering. For the lighting, I wanted to have there be a strong light source that is casting a lot of the character into shadow. I thought this would further push the sad and lonely feeling. To be honest, I was really winging it with the lighting and kind of just played around with it until it felt like it made sense. But for all I know, it's totally wrong. I figured some of the character would be casting a shadow onto the wall, so I made a silhouette of her and transformed it to the perspective of the lighting. For these shadows, I am using a cool muted blue set to multiply. The color will make things in the shadow look more cold, and cold colors are often associated with sadness. Plus, I plan to use very warm colors for where the light is hitting, so I wanted there to be a lot of contrast between the two. Next, I'm adding the details to the buildings I had drew earlier. I'm using a variety of colors to convey their forms. Since the buildings are far away, I wanted to avoid using any line work for them since I felt like this would draw more attention to them or make them feel more crisp, and I wanted them to feel very blurry and distant. To also help the buildings not stand out too much, I tried to only use colors for them that are mostly already present within the picture, so mostly reds, browns, and greens. If I threw in something like a hot pink, that would draw a lot of attention. Also, my favorite part was adding the little chimneys. I think they're really cute. To make the town feel more distant, I blurred it and also lowered the opacity. I'll also go over it later with a soft brush using white and blue to add a bit of atmosphere. Oh, I also decided to add some trees to make things feel livelier. I mostly just used a foliage brush and used different greens to add depth. I most often work from dark to light for foliage. Now on my cast shadow layer, I'm taking that muted blue and applying it to the character's dress. For this, I would apply the color and then blend it out with the blending tool. Like I said earlier, I'm going for a slightly painty look for this picture, so I wanted the shadows to look blendy, if that makes sense. This is my first pass of shadows. I will come back to the dress later to add further shading and highlights. I've mentioned this in previous videos recently, but for these pre-made videos, I'm often not sure what to talk about when I'm not talking about the art, since I don't want to talk about things that will not make sense or be too out of date. But I'm currently playing the game Dead Cells. It is a rated T game and it is a bit dark in concept. They do let you turn off the blood, so that's really nice. I instantly turned that off before even playing. In January, Nintendo was doing a game trial for Dead Cells, and I thought I'd give it a try since I am a fan of Metroidvania type games. But man, this one is really hard. Oh, also, I colored the stones of the building different shades of gray to help the tower feel less static and more interesting. It's an easy way to add a sense of variety, but I try to keep it pretty subtle so the stones don't feel too busy or distracting. Oh, and I'm also going back to the character to render her more. For her tights, I covered them with black and then erased the color away to add highlights. I always really like shading tights, but it's not something I get to do too often. Anyways, so yeah, Dead Cells is really hard. When you die, you have to start all over again from the beginning because it is a roguelike game. There are some permanent upgrades or abilities you keep, but you lose all of the cool weapons you found. Plus the levels are always changing each time you die. The most frustrating part is that I made it the furthest on my first ever run, and I haven't been able to get that far again. Like, why did I do my best on the first try? It's probably because I was being super slow and very careful, but now I'm speedrunning things a little bit more. But also, as you get new abilities, you unlock like harder sections of the map, and they can be really difficult. I really don't like the level of the lamps and darkness. I haven't been able to beat that one yet. But back to the drawing. After I had done this pass of rendering on the character, I wanted to try to work on other elements like the window frame. However, I ended up not working on this picture for a couple of weeks, mostly because I was busy working on other things. But I also lost motivation because I was not liking how the character was looking. I knew this was mostly because I needed to do more cleanup and rendering on the character, but I wanted to try to get the other boring details out of the way first. But the small conflict of me not liking how the character was looking was preventing me from working on the picture. So I decided to just let myself almost fully render the character to completion so that I would like her. The reason I was kind of preventing myself from finishing the character shading is because I wanted to keep some of the character to work on for later to help keep me motivated. When I need to color other details that may be more boring, like a window frame, I like to try to set aside a part I like for later to help me push through the boring part. However, as I said, in this case it was hindering me because I wasn't liking how the character was looking. Overall, for this rendering process, I'm finishing up some parts like the eyes. I'm also painting over the character to clean up details, and also do things like add more details to the hair. The hair was super fun to shade. To make it fit the cool shadow area, I mostly used a very muted soft blue as a highlight. I also liked adding the extra hair strands. Since things are more painty for this picture, I can work outside of my line work, and that can feel very freeing at times. Next is the window frame that I really didn't want to work on for some reason. It just sounded so boring. But once I got to working on it, it wasn't too bad. The kind of trickiest part was adding in the window panes. I felt like the easiest way to go about doing this was to make a layer over all the other layers, and then draw in the shapes of the glass by hand. I wanted the glass to be in the middle of the frame, so I needed to be able to draw on top of the frame layer itself. Once I had the glass in place, I lowered the opacity and erased it in some spots to make it more shiny or glass-like. I didn't want the glass to stand out a ton, so I made it pretty subtle. A lot of times glass in real life isn't all that noticeable unless the light is hitting it just the right way. And in this case, I didn't want it to be drawing a ton of attention. Oh, and to help the window feel more detailed, I added in the hinges and handles. Like with the glass, I painted them on top with a new layer. Now we are kind of onto the finishing details. First, I added a bit more form to the mountains. Nothing crazy, just some shadows to make them feel less flat. I wanted to keep the contrast pretty low to help them feel distant. Next, I painted in some clouds to help the sky feel less empty. In my head, it is morning time, so I'm using a mixture of purple and yellow for the clouds. I used my watercolor brush to paint in the clouds. I have found I really like using my watercolor brush for clouds since it has a very good texture for them. Third, I'm painting in the curtains. I kept debating on if I wanted to add the curtains or not, but I decided to add them since I did feel like it would help the picture feel more whimsical, and also add a bit more movement. In the original, the curtains felt more like heavy drapes, but I wanted to go with something more light this time around. Also, I didn't add the second curtain because I felt like it would make things a bit too busy on the left side of the picture, but I did add a slight indication of it inside the window. Also, I had painted in this wall off camera. At first I wasn't going to include it, but I decided to add it back in since I did feel like it helped add a sense of depth, and also framed in the bottom part of the picture a little bit. Next, to push the warm and cool feeling a bit more, I applied a warm gradient map to the picture and then erased the warm colors where I didn't want them. I then repeated the process with a blue gradient map and kept it where I wanted the colors to be cooler. For the blending modes of these layers, I just scrolled through them until I found ones that fit the look I wanted. Also, when in doubt, add more trees. At first I was going to keep the area in the window behind the character empty, but I thought things would be more interesting if I filled it with something. So I used some pattern brushes to make some bookshelves and then transformed them to fit with the perspective. Since they are a small background detail, I wasn't too worried about them being perfect. I am really glad that I added them though. I feel like the books further convey that this character is in this room a lot and actually lives in this room, compared to it just being an empty room. Lastly, I wanted to add some wildlife. This character's hair made me think of crows, so I used a crow brush I have to make a crow in the background. I shaded the crow a bit to help it fit with the setting. I also added a bit of a motion blur to it to make it look like it's moving. I also wanted to add a crow in the foreground to help further frame in the picture. I drew the crow with its beak pointing towards the girl to help draw the viewer's eye towards her. I was a bit nervous to draw the crow, but I have drawn crows a decent amount of times, so I was able to put that practice to use. Plus, it's mostly just a silhouette, so I didn't have to worry about details. Oh, and I almost forgot, I went back to the character and added some highlights to help her stand out. This picture was definitely a big project. It's been a while since I've spent so many hours working on a single piece, but it was also really fun working on a picture that wasn't just a character. The character also has a whole world around her. And so here's the original picture. It wasn't at all what I wanted, but it's what I could do at the time. Now we have the new version that is much closer to what younger me was envisioning. Instead of it just looking like a sad girl nearly falling out a window, we now have a character that conveys the feeling of yearning for the outside world. And overall, I'm really happy with it. I had a ton of fun with this video, and I hope to make more videos like this one in the future. If you know of any old pieces of art you'd like to see me redraw, I'd love to hear your suggestions in the comments. Well, that is all for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next week in my next video. Bye!